cialushows.com. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned to CILU 102.7 FM.
Good news, everyone. 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 Good news. Good news. There's a report on TV with some very bad news. Good news, everyone. Good news, everyone. Oh, that's good news. Good news, everyone. You heard the good news, everyone. Good news, everyone. Good news, everyone. I'm a horse's butt. I am. That's not good news at all, you little...
Just ask this scientician.
Now I'm going to discuss how we would look for a new law. In general, we look for a new law by the following process. First, we guess it. Then we well, don't laugh, that's really true. Then we compute the consequences of the guess to see what, if this is right, if this law that we guessed is right, we see what it would imply, and then we compare those computation results to nature. Or we say compare to experiment or experience. Compare it directly with observation to see if it works. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. And that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't make a difference how smart you are who made the guess or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it.
Futurama, Richard Feynman, and the Orphan Black theme from Canada's own clone-based multi-body secret lab sci-fi series. And what most wondrous thing do they all have in common? Science. Science is great. It's the literal best thing. And you know what else is fantastic? Superlatives. They are terrific words, just terrific. I've never met any better words than superlatives. And they're doing really great work. I have a theory that the current American president, what's-his-name, fantastic guy, I know him really well, called me up yesterday to congratulate me on how well this show is going. Anyway, I have this half idea that he arrived at his current social success through the magic of superlatives. He certainly doesn't focus on language as a conveyance of facts, but instead seems to favor spending as much public time as possible using extraordinary and often unjustified adjectives and adverbs that push the representational function of language literally to its breaking point. 10 out of 10. So my thought is to just experimentally see what happens if I include either a strong positive adjective or a word that takes us to the edge of what words can describe in every amazing sentence of this show. You're listening to the unbelievable CILU 102.7 FM. This is a marvelous program called the Cinematic Asylum, and you've tuned into the ultimate science and superlatives episode. And you're in luck because I'm literally the best radio show host ever, according to a 2018 poll conducted by Unrealistic Signifier magazine. Now, speaking of people who throw adjectives around, here's the best song ever.
First things first, I'ma say all the words inside my head. I'm fired up and tired of the way that things have been. Oh, the way that things have been. Oh. Second, don't you tell me what you think that I can be. I'm the one at the sail. I'm the master of my sea. Oh, the master of my sea. Oh. I was broken from a young age, taking my soul into the masses. Write down my poems for the few that look at me, took to me, shook to me, feeling me, singing from heartache, from the pain, taking my message, from the veins, speaking my lesson, from the brain, seeing the beauty through the... You made me a believer. You break me down, you build me a believer. I'll let them rain. My life, my love, my drive, it came from pain. You made me a believer, believer. Believer, believer. Believer, believer. My life, my love, my drive, it came from
That was the wonderful Maestro Zico's remix of Believer starring President Something J Something, who, for good or ill, is a master of throwing superlatives around. Superlative adjectives and science don't always mix. In science, we want to verify claims, but in marketing and poetry, we make statements that aren't really even claims. Legally, you can be investigated if your restaurant claims to sell a delicious cat meat burger, but in reality, it turns out you're just selling cow meat and calling it cat meat. But if you claim your cat burgers are the best on the planet, if you claim they're mind-blowingly delicious and no one beats your cat burgers, that can't be investigated. You can't be sued by Chairman Meow's Chinese Cat Meat Emporium for falsely asserting that your cat meat is better than theirs, because all these kinds of statements fall under a different rubric, a different jurisdiction. They're spinning around in someone else's wheelhouse. They aren't disputable factual claims. They are suggestive value invocations. Science wants to know if the facts are true, and adjectives, glorious adjectives, want to tell you what some people feel or might feel. And adjectives need a lot of freedom, a lot of wiggle room to do that. Therefore, we sometimes find that rational-minded investigators are reticent when they hear wonderful or astonishing or unparalleled claims. They are fantastically alert for possible false claims. But when they hear a crazily wonderful claim and react against it, what's going on there? Are they always just being put off by the potential non-validity of the claim, or are they having a temperamental reaction against soaring adjectives and freewheeling enthusiasm in general? Of course, we hope the sciences are filled up with sober, clear-minded, careful folk. But to be fair, we think it is fantastic when there's a mad scientist who over-enthusiastically catapults humanity into the future. A certain kind of fabulous tension exists between science and superlatives, just like it exists between atheists and the adherents of mythic membership religions. And I get people want to be clear-minded and make practical use of a certain suspicion toward enthusiasm, but really there doesn't need to be an antagonism between wonder, emotion, idealism, and scientific work. We can tell that from the efforts of our best scientists. Sure, your boring cousin Jimmy is doing drudge work in a pharmaceutical lab and going home at night to complain on social media about how stupid and superstitious everyone else is, but Einstein's giggling in a cathedral somewhere.
Just ask this scientician.
Science and Superlatives. That was the greatest computer music ever. It was literally composed by computers, which sample patterning sequences generated over at wolframtones.com. Wildly clever genius Stephen Wolfram wrote the excellent book A New Kind of Science to articulate his vision of how science is migrating toward the automated use of complex patterns. And his intriguing claim is that the majority of possible patterns in our cosmos are actually unpredictable, not random. They're totally deterministic. They're just too complex for any other complex thing, including our wonderful selves, to ever predict, like the digits of delicious pie. Doesn't mean we can't use these amazing natural super patterns. Just means we can't shortcut the process and get a sense of what they're going to do next. It will always seem like beautiful chaos to us. Wolfram thinks the age of algebra is over and that maybe that's the best idea I've ever heard. And this is the best idea of the Cinematic Asylum you've ever heard on CILU 102.7 FM in the shadow of the sleeping giant. Now, we generally think of science as a miraculously recent phenomenon, starting roughly with the great thinker Galileo, getting a boost perhaps from brilliant Descartes, hitting its stride with Newton, he's fabulous, isn't he? And the rest of the British Royal Society with a dash of Leibniz and a strip of bacon, and then exploding in the crazy, massive modern world of the 20th and 21st centuries. That story's not wrong, but there are tons of other equally marvelous and really good parts to the whole damn thing. The so-called European Enlightenment was a neat time, a really interesting time when our technology, economics, philosophy, and social customs all converged into the birth of modernity. But when we say that, we mean a big, special, easy-to-see version of modernity, a powerful and prominent version. A lot of people seemingly becoming modern all at the same time. We don't mean that that's the only time these types of ostensibly modern thinking and feeling and practicing were ever floating around on our beautiful planet. A small cabal of ancient and wise Mesoamericans were building highly accurate mathematical and astronomical systems for a while. The ancient Athenians went hard into rationality, technology, geometry, and democracy for a brief epoch. And who knows what terrific stuff was going on in China. Not even the Chinese, I hear. All I'm saying is the obviously truthiest thing of all, that bits of modernity and bits of modern science were popping up here and there for a long time, but they didn't sort of congeal into a whole new platform on a grand scale until about 17th century Europe. And maybe it was their terrific glasswork that did it. I mean, microscopes, telescopes, reading glasses, they all need lenses. Or maybe it was the printing press, machines leading to mass dissemination of information for individual brains to consume. Or who knows, maybe it was the successfully tricky work of the Bavarian Illuminati with their covert quasi-occult program to overthrow religions and monarchies and establish an international rational order of spiritual illumination and well-being, Weishaupt forever. Or maybe it was grand old Catholicism. For you can only hear so many times about equality before God and God as ultimate truth before you start getting interested in human equality and truth itself, even if that pushes you into conflict with God's traditional representatives. Causes for historical shifts come from multiple directions simultaneously, but they always end up being expressed in nifty philosophical changes. The scientific method, a big philosophical change, it was a radical new kind of methodology. Francis Bacon and the boys, guess and test taken to the next level on a rocket ship. It always seems to me like a doublethink, thinking twice, the double-checking revolution. If you double-check your thoughts, you end up reasoning, not just thinking. Cogito ergo sum, I am, therefore I am, 1 and 1 is 2, that checks out. It probably checks out the most. The thought on the left side of the equals sign is the same as the thought on the right side of the equals sign. That's double-checking. And when you do that same thing out in the world, you get experimental science. You have an idea? Fabulous. That's the first part. The second part is doing an equally fabulous test to see if you're correct. The first bit of data has to check out against the second bit of data. It's like a new rule, a new approach to data, double-checking. Though, of course, this also requires many prerequisites, great things, the best things. It requires that you are strong and bold. I mean that you have to make an effort in your thinking rather than just suffering whatever your thoughts want to convey to you, and you have to be willing to be wrong. That's courageous. Every experiment requires that your curiosity or morality is greater than your natural resistance to discovering that your first thought, however magnificent, was not quite correct. So there's a caution here, a work, a beautiful nuance that takes a stand apart from the normal demonizing and laudatory speech of the dogmatic folk spirit. That old traditional folk spirit is like people in movies who praise your husband until the divorce and then ridiculously demonize him after that. There's an old-fashioned hyperbolic loyalty logic that's always looking out greedily for what to praise and what to condemn. They seem to get together on a big magic book and use that to denounce many things and assert many other things as the greatest things of all. They mean well, I think, but they can also be rather abusive as soon as you want something more sensitive or more accurate to show up in the world. They don't think they're being abusive, they think they're helping. Hashtag sad, hashtag fake news. When you wonder aloud why the stars really twinkle, they think you just said you have a sore leg and they immediately try to correct the problem. They already have all the answers they need in order to mouth off positively or negatively. So when you say you don't have an answer yet, that you have a question, they might treat you like an infant, invalid, or infidel who for some reason hasn't comprehended yet that everything you already need to know is in the Quran, the Mahabharata, or the ranting of some stressful grandparents, or maybe it's already just covered by our everyday habits and ceremonies. That's the old method. The elders, meaning just the old people, not necessarily spiritually mature people, or custodians of a super useful lore that hardly changed at all for thousands of years. That's knowledge. If you wonder about something, then maybe you've just not heard or obeyed the knowledge well enough. After all, it's good, it's the best, anything else is bad, but knowledge by itself isn't good enough anymore. You need today a theory of knowledge, a method of getting knowledge, better knowledge, a technique for separating knowledge into validated and non-validated information. You need a way of studying knowledge, a knowledge of knowledges, a scienceology, maybe Scientology. They're terrific. They donate a lot of money to this show.
I'm making a note here, huge success. It's hard to overstate my satisfaction. Aperture science. We do what we must because we can. For the good of all of us, except the ones who are dead. But there's no sense crying over every mistake. You just keep on trying till you run out of cake. And the science gets done and you make a neat gun for the people who are still alive. I'm not even angry. I'm being so sincere right now. Even though you broke my heart and killed me and tore me to pieces and threw every piece into a fire. As they burned, it hurt because I was so happy for you. Now these points of data make a beautiful line, and we're out of data, we're releasing on time. So I'm glad I got burned. Think of all the things we learned for the people who are still alive. Go ahead and leave me. I think I'd prefer to stay inside. Maybe you'll find someone else to help you. Maybe Black Mesa. That was a joke, haha, that chance. Anyway, this cake is great. It's so delicious and moist. Look at me still talking when there's science to do. When I look up there, it makes me glad I'm not you. I've experiments to run. There is research to be done on the people who are still alive. And believe me, I am still alive. I'm doing science and I'm still alive. I feel fantastic and I'm still alive. While you're dying, I'll be still alive. And when you're dead, I will be still alive. Still alive. Still alive.
Just ask this scientician.
There's antimony, arsenic, aluminum, selenium, and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen and rhenium, and nickel, neodymium, neptunium, germanium, and iron, americium, ruthenium, uranium, europium, zirconium, lutetium, vanadium, and lanthanum, and osmium, and astatine, and radium, and gold, protactinium, and indium, and gallium, and iodine, and thorium, and thulium, and thallium. There's yttrium, ytterbium, actinium, rubidium, and boron, gadolinium, niobium, iridium, and strontium, and silicon, and silver, and samarium, and bismuth, bromine, lithium, beryllium, and barium. There's holmium and helium and hafnium and erbium and phosphorus and francium and fluorine and terbium and manganese and mercurium, molybdenum, magnesium, dysprosium and scandium and cerium and cesium and lead, praseodymium and platinum, plutonium, palladium, promethium, potassium, polonium and tantalum, technetium, titanium, tellurium and cadmium and calcium and chromium and curium. There's sulfur, californium, and fermium, berkelium, and also mendelevium, einsteinium, nobelium, and argon, krypton, neon, radon, xenon, zinc, and rhodium, and chlorine, carbon, cobalt, copper, tungsten, tin, and sodium. These are the only ones of which the news has come to Harvard. And there may be many others, but they haven't been discovered.
That was Still Alive from the Portal digital computer game soundtrack and the Elements song by Tom Lehrer. You're listening to the Science and Superlatives episode of the Cinematic Asylum on CILU 102.7 FM. Sometimes we have this great idea that most people are whacked out, deluded believers or fantasy-prone personalities who don't see the true objects that are right in front of their faces. Spare me your flights of fantasy and kick a rock. The world is made of hard things that our eyes can see. Too many idealists, not enough empiricists. But the observation of empirical facts is not always all it's cracked up to be. There were always pragmatists, but there's a ton of crazy real stuff they never knew about, and a lot of obvious stuff that just ain't so. So we want to be careful to distinguish scientific thinking from mere sensory observation. Because empirical data, marvelous as it is, can be wonderfully misleading, and your senses lie to you as much or more than your imagination does. Science is about explaining what you can see better and better in terms of what you can't see. It relies on what you can't see. You can't see rationality or logic or laws of physics or a Planck scale wiggle in the quantum field. In fact, your brain is hallucinating your entire sensory reality. Not out of thin air, but out of the incoming electromagnetic zips and zoops that in and of themselves don't look anything like a dandy donkey, tremendous tree, or fabulous fish. So we're wisely cautious about conflating science with empiricism, but, excellently, the scientific spirit also really is characterized by this extraordinary interest in making more detailed observations about the natural world. If you've ever watched the Slow-Mo guys on YouTube, great show, my favorite show, demonstrating what every kind of thing from hummingbird wings to exploding candy bars to balloons popping or flying fish hitting people in the face looks like at 250,000 frames per second in ultra-slow motion, well, this is a real part of the ongoing scientific endeavor. It's part of the spirit of science which has always supported the methodology. It's no accident that so much of science came from amateurs making extra observations about the world around us, intrepid data hunters seeking our normally unobserved observations, especially amazing things that go beyond our eyes, telescopes, microscopes, faster and slower lenses. What we see is only a tiny slice of the real things around us, and our intuition is rational only in the degree to which it works with reality, and it's hard to develop an instinct for things that your species never detects, whether they be quarks, germs, distant planets, or the ultra-slow movements of colored paint on an old speaker. So if we want to be rational, we have to develop an instinct based on perceiving as many types of real patterns as possible, and we need machines, we need instruments, we need prostheses to help do this for us. We've got to do the good work of looking more, looking harder, looking where we don't normally look. This unbelievably excellent desire to see more of what goes on in the processes around us is just as important as the need to set standards for explanation which exceed mere observation. Human beings, great beings, some of my best beings are human beings, have always had peak experiences. They love peaks. Humans can't get enough peaks. If you're reasonably healthy and engaged in what you're doing, or have taken the right drugs, or have blundered into the appropriate geoelectromagnetic weird zone deep in the forest, you have these little overflowing epiphanies that make life worth living. But most of us don't follow up on that stuff with any effort or analysis. We take it at face value or shake it off as just one of those things, but there is something else we can do. We could try, scientifically speaking, to learn from it, to use it as a prompt to discover more about our terrific universe. Normally we're too lazy, not curious enough, but apparently Pythagoras discovered the relationship between music and mathematics because he was out walking one sunny day, got into a good rhythm, had this exquisite moment of meaningful validation and empowerment, a great peak, and then noticed the rhythm in his mind was coming from the nice combinations of sounds issuing from a distant blacksmith's shop. So he rushes over in this epiphanic state and watches the blacksmith, best blacksmith, until Pythagoras could see how the pleasant quality of the tones and their interblending resulted from the particular proportionalities in the length of the metals and where they were struck. He tried to duplicate the effect at home using a stringed instrument, and this gave rise to our modern notion of the musical octave. Think about that the next time you have a nice moment. Try putting some work in, for God's sake. Archimedes didn't just leap naked and blazing from his bathtub and rush through the streets proclaiming his unity with all of being or the ultimate usefulness of the Lord, but rather those same profound feelings and fabulous vibes accompanied his emerging effort of clarity about how different substances can be correctly identified using the displacement of water. Einstein once said his happiest thought, his best existential moment, was when he clearly and practically understood that gravity and relative acceleration are the same phenomenon. Imagine that was the thought that accompanied your most intense emotional peak experience. Here's a song from Seth MacFarlane, who you might not normally associate with science, but he not only runs and stars in the science-based sci-fi series The Orville, he's also a primary producer and sponsor of the new version of Cosmos on PBS.
Well, either you're closing your eyes to a situation you do not wish to acknowledge, or you are not aware of the caliber of disaster indicated by the presence of a pool table in your community. Well, you got trouble, my friends. Right here, I say trouble right here in River City. Why, sure, I'm a pool player. Certainly mighty proud to say I'm always mighty proud to say it. I consider that the hours I spend with a cue in my hand are golden. Help you cultivate horse sense, and a cool head, and a keen eye. Did you ever take a try to give an ironclad lead to yourself from a three-rail billiard shot? But just as I say, it takes judgment, brains, and maturity to score at a balk-line game. I say that any boob can take and shove a ball in a pocket. And I call that sloth. The first big step on the road to the depths of degradation. I say first, medicinal wine from a teaspoon, then beer from a bottle. And the next thing you know, your son is playing for money in a pinchback suit and listening to some big out-of-town Jasper hearing him tell about horse race gambling. Not a wholesome trotting race, no, but a race where they set down right on the horse. Like to see some stuck-up jockey boy setting on Dan Patch, make your blood boil, well, I should say. Now, friends, let me tell you what I mean. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pockets in a table. Pockets that mark the difference between a gentleman and a bum with a capital B, and that rhymes with P, and that stands for pool. And all week long, your River City youth will be frittering away. I say your young men will be frittering away their noontime, supper time, short time too. Get the ball in the pocket. Never mind getting dandelions pulled to the screen door, patched to the beefsteak pounded. Never mind pumping any water till your parents are caught with a cistern empty on a Saturday night, and that's trouble. Oh, you got lots and lots of trouble. I'm thinking of the kids in the Knickerbocker, sure-tailed young ones, peeking in the pool hall winter after school. You got trouble, folks, right here in River City. Trouble with a capital T, and that rhymes with P, and that stands for pool. Now, I know all you folks are the right kind of parents. I'm gonna be perfectly frank. Would you like to know what kind of conversation goes on while they're loafing around that hall? They'll be trying out Bevo, trying out Cubets, trying out tailor-mades like cigarette fiends, and bragging all about how they're gonna cover up a telltale breath with sense. And one fine night, they leave the pool hall, heading for the dance at the Armory. Libertine men in scarlet women, and ragtime, shameless music that'll grab your son, your daughter, with the arms of a jungle animal instinct. Mass hysteria! The idle brain is the devil's playground. Trouble! Right here in River City. With a capital T, and that rhymes with P, and that stands for pool. We've surely got trouble. Right here in River City. Gotta figure out a way to keep the young ones moral after school. Mothers of River City, heed that warning before it's too late. Watch for the telltale signs of corruption. The minute your son leaves the house, does he rebuckle his knickerbockers below the knee?
Just ask this scientician.
CILU is sponsored in part by the students of Lakehead University, our listeners, and our sponsors. At this time, we would like to thank the following sponsors for their continuous support.
The Thunder Bay Country Market, keeping it local every Saturday from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. and every Wednesday from 3:30 to 6:30 year-round. Stop by and say hi to over 80 vendors who make it, bake it, and grow it in the Dove Building located on the CLE grounds. The Lakehead Unitarian Fellowship, an inclusive spiritual community promoting a compassionate, just, and sustainable world. Find them online at luf.ca, on Facebook, or 129 South Ogoma, Sundays at 10:30 a.m. Sensia Corporate Web Solutions. Log on to sensia.ca for information about locally owned and operated hosting, site creation, and more.
From my heart and from my hand, why don't people understand my intention? And pens, bits and pieces, and magic from the hand of making weird science. Things I've never seen before. Behind bolted doors and an imagination. Weird science. Not what teachers said to do. Making dreams come true. Living tissue, warm flesh. Weird science. Plastic tubes and pots and pans, bits and pieces, bits and pieces, bits of my creation. Is it real? Electricity will make it weird science. Fantasy and microchips shooting from the hip. Something different will make it weird science. Pictures from a magazine, diagrams and charts, mending broken hearts and make it weird science. Something like a recipe, bits and pieces, bits and pieces, bits of my creation. Is it real? It's my creation. Understand my intentions. Ooh, weird science, magic and technology. Weird science, things I've never seen before. Behind open doors. Weird science, not what teachers said to do. Bits and pieces, bits and pieces, bits of my creation.
That was part of a version of Oingo Boingo's Weird Science from the movie Weird Science on the Science and Superlatives episode of the Cinematic Asylum on CILU 102.7 with Someone Like Me. The fascinating and remarkable individual L. Ron Hubbard leveled up his ambiguous therapeutic practices into the famous religion of Scientology, an intriguing name which he defined etymologically as the knowledge of knowing, the study of the process of knowing, a Scientology. In general, that's a pretty amazingly good idea, knowing how to know. It's already, in a sense, the central principle of science itself. Knowledge, taken to the next level, becomes this powerful new thing, a methodology of knowledge. One of the best methodologies ever. A way of getting knowledge right, rather than just taking up common knowledge or trusting your own thoughts. People who are quite justifiably upset with some of the negative cultural and ecological consequences of industrial civilization often deride science for hubris, for playing God, and they start to sound like medieval rabble superstitiously preferring whatever goes on normally, even if normal is secretly terrible. The idea of scientific hubris is mostly a projection of the kinds of minds that think they know everything already, whereas science itself seems to be, or ideally is, possessed by a kind of humility based on the fact that we have to figure out things because we don't know them already. Sherlock Holmes, for many people, is the epitome of a rational mind figuring things out. deducing and inducing, decoding clues from scenarios and scenarios from clues, just like a scientist does. Forensic science inspired and was inspired by Conan Doyle's famous consulting detective and legendary opiate addict, in part because of how well that character's allure captured the still rising flavor of modernity, progress, detail orientation, and iconoclastic individualistic reasoning powers. Holmes thinks for himself. He ignores customs if they don't suit him. He honors capacity in other individuals. He tries to prevent himself from making unnecessary assumptions. He inspects small details, forms coherent narrative guesses, and then checks them against other small details. He looks at the world more closely than most do and disciplines himself to work with logic and probabilities. He moves freely between social classes, tries not to be prejudiced, and honors himself for his brain development. These are among the high virtues and hallmarks of modernity, Enlightenment values, the same values that powered Newton, Faraday, Gutenberg, Leibniz, Confucius, Pythagoras, Feynman, Curie, and more. Fantastic. I love Sherlock Holmes. Vlad Gushenko's high-speed remix of the game is on, the theme song from BBC's Sherlock. Superlatives, specifically, and adjectives generally, exert a wondrous kind of low-level hypnotic effect that makes them very attractive to authors, orators, salesmen, and magicians. The difference between Doug, my friend Doug, and my best friend Doug is not just that you learn more about my emotions and the nature of our relationship. It's also that your attention has to stay longer on the piece of information, my very best friend Doug. The idea is combined fabulously with a feeling. A feeling is like a slant or a valence that points towards something in a charged manner. Each adjective adds a titch of micro-momentum to the cognition of the content of the linguistic exchange. But if you keep going, if you keep getting the micro-momentum hits, that might just add up to something, and pretty soon people who thought they were critically processing your words are now just moving along from one fantastic to one unbelievably to one incredible thing after another, in a smooth flow of half-consciousness that allows hidden aspects of their personality to rise to the surface. The qualitative intensifier, represented by the adjective, holds and directs attention in people's brains without necessarily giving you more data about objects. The hammer is not just any hammer. This hammer is very meaningful to me. It's an important hammer. This hammer, whether you know it or not, evokes a very powerful sensation in me. And if I tell you a little more about why this particular hammer is so uniquely interesting to me, you'll probably find you start to feel amazed also about this remarkable device. You see, I don't give you any more information. I offer you a slight shift of consciousness. That's what adjectives do. Or perhaps we could say I didn't give you any more information about what theosophists call the gross realm, matter, mass, physical energy, things bigger than Planck and slower than light. It could be possible, perhaps, that qualities and qualifiers are not secondary epiphenomenon derived from the physical universe, but constitute an additional realm of their own. A dream realm? Hard to say. A realm of nesses. Redness. Is redness something different than red? Is happiness different from merely the material causes of the brain chemistry of a happy person? Is wonderfulness, abstractness, elusiveness, Eliotness, Lochness, absurdness, ness, are those things in and of themselves or not? I'll leave that to you. Probably the best thing in the world, though, a realm of qualities, but it would also have to have negative qualities. Demons in the other world. There could even be negative superlatives, though we don't think about that too much. Reverse superlatives, reverlatives. We use them a lot. The darkest hour, the worst hotel, the most unbearable torment. Almost all our ideas about what a hell might look like involve negative superlatives. I don't mind a little torture, but I don't want any of that unbelievably excruciating torture, what with the wailing and the gnashing and the heat. My God, the heat. Etymologically now, what a great melogically, the best melogically. Anyway, etymologically, science started to mean something like verified knowledge about the mid-14th century, I'm told. Synonymous around then with what we call information, though it took till the 17th century for it to become associated with the scientific methods. Originally, it seems to have meant something like analysis. Scientists, scier, to know, probably originally to separate things, to distinguish, related to cinder, to cut up, to divide, shinzen, to split, rend, cleave, the Gothic skydan and the English skedan, to divide, to separate. Now just have a look or hear and analyze something, look at its parts, move beyond the knowledge of what the thing is to hack apart its separate functional parts and examine how they fit together. That's something like what the word science has always suggested. And that kind of thinking is a big piece of the modern scientific revolution, looking at how the different parts of something function together. We used to consider whales to be fish, the best fish, the biggest fish, and that wasn't just a mistake, it was based on a whole different approach. After all, whales have a basically fish-like shape, and they live in the water where the fish live. Fishermen can catch them and eat them. It's very reasonable to think of them as fish. It's not a shift from unreasonable to reasonable when we start calling them mammals. The fish thing is based on good observation and practicality. It's only when you start to look at the functions and the relationship of the inside parts that you change your mind. When you cut it open, you notice it has a heart that helps warm blood circulate through its body and a womb that gives birth to live young rather than eggs. Well, that's very mammal-like. Cows and people and raccoons, I love raccoons, mammal stuff, all that kind of stuff. So when you're looking at how the parts function together within the structure, you might decide it's a mammal. When you're looking at shape, habitat, and what we do with it, you might decide it's a fish. We call one of those scientific because science is related mentally and sometimes physically to dissecting things, taking them apart to see how they operate as a system of parts. That's fantastic. I love it.
The sun is a miasma of incandescent plasma. The sun's not simply made out of gas. No, no, no. The sun is a quagmire. It's not made of fire. Forget what you've been told in the past. Plasma. Electrons are free. Plasma. A fourth state of matter, not gas, not liquid, not solid. The sun is no red dwarf. I hope it never morphs into some supernova collapse. Or, the sun is a miasma of incandescent plasma. I forget what I was told by myself. Elf. Plasma. Electrons are free. Plasma. A fourth state of matter, not gas, not liquid, not solid. Forget that song. Plasma. They got it wrong. That thesis has been rendered invalid.
Why Does the Sun Really Shine by They Might Be Giants. Famously, they recorded a song about the science of the sun, and the science changed, and they re-recorded the song to get the facts straight. Facts, let's face it, we hate new facts. We have this terrific familiarity bias, one of my favorite biases, that tells us that, well, that things we've already heard and seen are just inherently, all things being equal, better than new things. I know these bushes very well. I don't know that snake very well. I should be able to rapidly detect and avoid the unfamiliar with contrast to the familiar. It's a good thing from the point of view of evolutionary neurobiology. The problem comes when the familiar is limited or wrong, or someone tries to help you understand a more true and useful fact, and you automatically feel that they must be dupes or enemies, and that you should double down on preferring what you already feel is true, rather than wasting time feeling uncomfortable trying to change your mind and agree with these obvious fools. That's the hidden hubris of the norm. Human cultures, great cultures, love their work. They fall into this trap. Even official scientific societies fall into this trap. They cease to be scientific, in a sense, when they start to be a society. Unfamiliar theories are scorned on general principle, just like we assume that our kids are more likely to be attacked by strangers, or that assaults in a frontier town, all things being equal, were probably committed by that dark-skinned stranger whom none of us recognize. We should hang him, just to be safe. We're not rational beings at heart. Or maybe we are, but rationality is a complex and unconscious process largely designed to serve animal purposes. It isn't normal to be honest and accurate. That's a reasonably recent and somewhat peculiar thing. Friedrich Nietzsche said truth was like a coin with all the markings rubbed off. When words no longer serve their original purpose of discharging emotions or trying to get us what we want, then they're just lying around for some neutral function like objective description of reality. The coin is not a coin anymore now, so you can use the gold for anything you like. It takes a tremendous long time for that to happen. If you gave a cat the power to speak through a process of evolution, do you think it would use words to convey accurate facts about the objective universe? Or do you think it might say whatever would get it some of that tasty, tasty fish? Cats are liars. All cats, #sad. That's why we put them in those burgers down at that terrific cat meat place. My point, of course, is that the ancient, natural, and normal way is to be consciously irrational, untruthful, and misleading. That can be a beautiful and useful thing. It doesn't have to be awful, but it takes a long time, thousands and thousands of years, before people's collective lies start to wear out and hold themselves in check, like one of your arms trying to wrestle the other into a stalemate. Once it does stalemate the situation, you could start to build on the relative stability of the new form. That's when you start noticing that statements could be free from their original purpose, set free to climb to new heights or explore new nooks, and that this freedom feels good, feels great, feels like flying, and you can make wonderful discoveries, objectively true discoveries. It's exhilarating. You're listening to Science and Superlatives, meandering wildly on the Cinematic Asylum on CILU 102.7 FM. And when René Descartes, fabulous guy, got back to France, he said after the war, he said he had become so used to living in foreign lands among foreign people with different clothes, cloths, fads, foods, weird speech habits, that now even his own homeland seemed to him no different. Just another weird place where humans put on strange costumes, made strange claims, and ate strange meals. Descartes had become a man of the wide, wide world rather than just a man of noble France. Not by hearing that one should be a man of the world, not by being taught in school about the universality of human rights, but by actually living and working and suffering and rejoicing among different kinds of culture enacted by different kinds of people with whom he had different kinds of relationships. When René got home, he created the geometric grid. I say grid instead of grid. I think that's going to catch on. It's way better. It's the best, Jerry. So Descartes set European geometric algebra off and running and tried to work out the first real logical philosophy based on the individual's own existential doubts and reasoning. He was a thoroughly modern fellow because he actually lived through the experiences that allowed his inner plant to grow past its home soil into the human soil, the world's soil. We don't always do that anymore. We got the idea that everyone should be able to read and write and do maths and understand the news and converse moderately well during the office coffee break about geopolitics, race relations, new technology, and the election. So we started to round up children and tell them all this stuff and then ask them to repeat it back so we could confirm whether or not we were doing a good job of telling them how to be modern citizens. But telling doesn't really get the whole thing done. This process often neglects the time, energy, and wonderful natural experiences from which modern thinking historically grew. We hear 1,000 times that our stupid ancestors thought the earth was flat until modern explorers and calculators and new machines revealed it was a round ball. Hooray. But mostly we didn't figure that out for ourselves. In our authentic inner life, it's mostly unproven still. No one demonstrated it to our obvious and instinctive satisfaction. We didn't go through enough flow state demonstrations to personally assimilate that principle to the point where we could clearly explain our conclusions to other people so they could check for themselves easily. Instead, we grow up as modern individual humans with a scientific worldview. But what good is a received worldview? A set of facts and values that other people have told you? Isn't that pretty much like a belief? Isn't that basically the same as what everyone was doing before the scientific modern revolution? Aren't we kind of indoctrinating kids into the results of science instead of teaching them how to find out answers for themselves? And so when Reverend Jimmy down at the local Mixitarian church says science is a new religion, he's not wrong. And when people start to wonder if the world is maybe really flat after all, it could be they're just pissed that they were told and sold so many things without being really helped to experience the art of proving them to themselves objectively and rationally. They've been asked to pretend to be part of a world that's already figured things out without them, and eventually that gets frustrating. You want to go back to the last world that made actual visceral sense to you as individuals, and that's not wrong. It should be a wake-up call to our educational institutions. It might not be important what we teach kids. The facts, the world, the values, those may not be the main things. It might be that people need to learn by practice how to create facts, worlds, and values and rationally analyze the predictive nuances of what they hear. Otherwise, the best and truest things in the world could be stored in your brains as if they were no better than beliefs or dogmas. You definitely get scientism instead of science that way. You get humanism instead of humans. You get modern culture instead of modern minds.
Small children may have perhaps been put in the embarrassing position of being unable to do your child's arithmetic homework because of the current revolution in mathematics teaching known as the new math. So as a public service here tonight, I thought I would offer a brief lesson in the new math. Tonight, we're going to cover subtraction. This is the first room I've worked for a while. It didn't have a blackboard, so we will have to make do with more primitive visual aids, as they say in the ed biz. Consider the following subtraction problem, which I will put up here. 342 minus 173. Now, remember how we used to do that. 3 from 2 is 9, carry the 1, and if you're under 35 or went to a private school, you say 7 from 3 is 6, but if you're over 35 and went to a public school, you say 8 from 4 is 6. And carry the 1, so we have 169. But in the new approach, as you know, the important thing is to understand what you're doing rather than to get the right answer. Here's how they do it now. You can't take 3 from 2. 2 is less than 3, so you look at the 4 in the tens place. Now that's really 4 tens, so you make 3 tens, regroup, and you change a 10 to 10 ones, and you add them to the 2 and get 12, and you take away 3, that's 9. Is that clear? Now instead of 4 in the tens place, you've got 3 because you added 1, that is to say 10 to the 2, but you can't take 7 from 3, so you look in the hundreds place. From the 3 you then use 1 to make 10 ones, and you know why 4 plus minus 1 plus 10 is 14 minus 1, because addition is commutative, right? And so you got 13 tens and you take away 7, and that leaves 5. Well, 6 actually, but the idea is the important thing. Now go back to the hundreds place. You're left with 2 and you take away 1 from 2 and that leaves... Everybody get 1? Not bad for the first day. Hooray for new math, new math. It won't do you a bit of good to review math. It's so simple, so very simple, that only a child can do it. Now that actually is not the answer that I had in mind, because the book that I got this problem out of wants you to do it in base 8. But don't panic. Base 8 is just like base 10, really, if you're missing 2 fingers. Shall we have a go at it? Hang on. You can't take 3 from 2. 2 is less than 3, so you look at the 4 in the 8's place. Now that's really 4 8s, so you make it 3 8s, regroup, and you change an 8 to 8 ones, and you add to the 2, and you get 1 2 base 8, which is 10 base 10, and you take away 3, that's 7. Okay? Now instead of 4 in the 8's place, you've got 3 because you added 1, that is to say 8, to the 2, but you can't take 7 from 3, so you look at the 64s. 64. How did 64 get into it? I hear you cry. Well, 64 is 8 squared, don't you see? When you ask a silly question, you get a silly answer. From the 3, you then use 1 to make 8 ones. You add those 1s to the 3, and you get 1 3 base 8, or in other words, in base 10, you have 11, and you take away 7, and 7 from 11 is 4. Now go back to the 64s. You're left with 2, and you take away 1 from 2, and that leaves... Now, let's not always see the same hands. One, that's right. Whoever got 1 can stay after the show and clean the erasers. Hooray for new math, new math. It won't do you a bit of good to review math. It's so simple, so very simple, that only a child can do it. Come back tomorrow night. We're gonna do fractions.
That was New Math from Tom Lehrer, giving us a hint of the complexity that arises from multiple different systems of computation. Science has this interesting feature of being able to be plural. It has paradigms, alternatives, counterfactuals, different computations and computational styles for the same facts. It even has a multiverse. It has many worlds. The many worlds theory of quantum physics, arguably the only understanding of quantum math that satisfies Einstein's requirements about locality, realism, and determinism. One of its leading exponents is the great physicist and quantum computer pioneer David Deutsch, and he also specializes in clarifying the difference between scientific and non-scientific ideas. The difference, Deutsch says, is that between good and bad explanations, and it's interesting. It's not about being reasonable or having testable observations. He points out that a lot of bad explanations are reasonable and have testable observations. I believe a giant goat kicked the sun to make it go around the earth, and I go out and I check, and it's going around the earth, so that checks out. Plausible, verifiable, observation-based. But not a good explanation at all. Why? Well, Deutsch says that's because it can be easily varied. I could just as well have said giant cockroach instead of giant goat, or an army of alien robots, or a government conspiracy. My results would keep checking out, even if my hypothesis kept changing, so that's a bad explanation. A good explanation is hard to adjust. A scientific explanation should fail completely if it's off by even a little bit. If Einstein's theory of relativity had said that the light of a distant star would be bent a little to the right of the sun during an eclipse and instead it was bent to the left, then his whole explanation is wrong. And that's because it's a good explanation. It didn't say something or other would happen. It said exactly this would happen by exactly this amount. That's tremendous. And if that's not exactly what happens, then it's back to the drawing board. You don't get to be basically correct. And explanations like this start driving human knowledge forward at an exceptional rate. Maybe it's the best form of explanation we've ever discovered. I've been the most terrific professional terrificist Layman Pascal, talking to you about science and superlatives on the even more terrific Cinematic Asylum on the terrificest CILU 102.7 FM with our remarkable Science and Superlatives episode. You've never heard anything like it. Now here is my favorite quantum physicist, David Deutsch, doing a little talk on explanation.
That all that, discovered in 40 years, had not been in the previous 100,000, was not for lack of thinking about stars and all those other urgent problems they had. They even arrived at answers, such as myths, that dominated their lives, yet bore almost no resemblance to the truth. The tragedy of that protracted stagnation isn't sufficiently recognized, I think. These were people with brains of essentially the same design that eventually did discover all those things. But that ability to make progress remained almost unused until the event that revolutionized the human condition and changed the universe, or so we should hope, because that event was the scientific revolution, ever since which our knowledge of the physical world and of how to adapt it to our wishes has been growing relentlessly. Now, what had changed? What were people now doing for the first time that made that difference between stagnation and rapid, open-ended discovery? How to make that difference is surely the most important universal truth that it's possible to know.
Attention Lakehead students. Lakehead International is now seeking enthusiastic students to become peer mentors for the fall semester. Build your leadership skills and gain valuable experience while helping new international students get acquainted with Lakehead University campus and the Thunder Bay community. The Peer Mentor will assist new students with their general needs, refer them to on-campus resources, and help organize fun social activities. Eligible applicants will be returning full-time students who've demonstrated leadership experience and will receive a small honorarium at the end of the semester. For more info, contact peermentor.intl@lakeheadu.ca.
Copperfin Credit Union is Northwestern Ontario's largest locally owned credit union, where we work with you to provide the financial solutions that meet your goals. At Copperfin, ownership has its perks. We put our members first by sharing profits, giving back to the communities we serve, and by providing branches with your convenience in mind. Experience the perks online at any of our 7 branches or access one of the thousands of ding-free ATMs across Canada. Copperfin Credit Union. Life forward.
CILU is sponsored in part by the students of Lakehead University, our listeners, and our sponsors. At this time, we would like to thank the following sponsors for their continuous support.
The Thunder Bay Community Auditorium. Find them at TV.